So today's topic is we are going to be talking about prestige edges in Pathfinder for Savage Worlds. We did the poll last week, and it was a fairly close race between spellcasting and prestige edges. And I figured, you know what? A lot of people wanted to see what was going on with prestige edges and hear about the design behind that. And it's something I'm not seeing a lot of people talk about, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? A lot of folks were talking about spellcasting, so that's why I put it on the poll. I kind of figured that would be the one because that's got the most controversy behind it, that we're doing things that folks either really like or really don't like, which generally speaking is a sign of a good design, is when you have that polarized, because you're not going to make everybody happy. Trying to make everybody happy is actually how you get a worse product. But I knew there was going to be a lot of, a lot of people were like, I don't understand why it's like this is. And especially that statement, right? I don't understand why the team has done this in this rule set is an answer we can really well solve on Design Corner. And that's why it might come on. But I don't see a lot of folks talking about prestige edges. What, generally speaking, when I see folks talk about prestige edges, and if I see 10 posts about spellcasting, I see one post about prestige edges, or it's part of a post of something else, which signals to me, because there's not a lot of people talking about how awful they are, we've done a good job with them, right? For the most part, folks look at the prestige edges and they're pretty satisfied with what they get. But I think it's a useful exercise because it helps us explain some other things, to go through and talk about what is the design of the prestige edges, because it's kind of emblematic of a lot of the other design that we've done, especially when it comes to classes. And I think the prestige edges are a little bit more of a constrained problem that don't have as much breadth, and so it's a little easier to go through the design of a prestige edge in Pathfinder and then talk about it in the context of Savage Pathfinder. And I'll jump into that after we go through a couple of examples, PK Levine. Because so I'm gonna throw out a caveat, right? Before we start talking about prestige edges in general. One, I have not designed all of these. I've had, relatively speaking, very little input on most of them, and then some input on others, right? Basically, it's I'm saying this because there are some instances in which I'm not going to know the history of the design of all of the edges, right? So Arcane Archer, Shadow Dancer, and Mystic Theurge, I've all, in one way or another, directly worked on. So I've got a pretty good concept of how all of them have evolved. Hey, Havenheart. For the others, I've got, I've seen them as we've play tested and as the rules have changed, but I've not necessarily been involved in every single discussion. Thankfully, I would hate to be involved in every single discussion that we have for Savage Pathfinder. We would have a tenth of the book done if if everybody had to weigh in on everything. As I said about magic items last week, I cherish my ignorance on a lot of the design work that went into that, because that's not that's a big chunk, and I'm glad Mike and Shane were able to handle the body of it, so that way I didn't have to touch it. So I think the first place that kind of we started with all of the prestige edges, right, and this is true of most things, period, in Savage Pathfinder, is you got to know what does it do in the Pathfinder version. So let's go ahead and start with the Arcane Archer. Primarily because the Arcane Archer is fresh in my mind, as I have most recently been playing one in our playtests of Rise of the Runelords. I was going to retest the Mystic Theurge this week, but we did a playtest. We missed last week because we had a bunch of just tasks that we needed to get done. So we were like, okay, let's play again let's make up for that on Monday, and then we'll play again on Thursday. We'll just do two play tests this week. But I've not had time since Monday, when we ended book 3 and jumped into book 4, to make the new Mystic Theurge I was going to play test. So I'm probably going to be the Arcane Archer in an hour when that play test starts. So if we look at, and again, this is just on D20 PFSRD because it's the easiest way for me to share stuff with you folks. So this section that has basically the kind of description of what an arcane archer is and all that, what their role are, what their typical elements are, what type of core classes are useful to have to then go into arcane archer. That's useful to a certain degree, but primarily we're never going to be changing that stuff, right? That's not our brief. We're not saying, okay, our arcane archer would instead have this description because they're not the same as the Pathfinder arcane archer. In the setting of Galerion, the narrative position that arcane archers hold are the same in our game as they are in their game. Uh, uh, Mike Barbeau from the dev team is here to lurk and implement edits in books, and he is not all out of edits. I don't think we're going to be out of edits for a long time. And then once Rise 1 goes out, Mike, then you'll have a lot more edits to do if the veracity at which people had feedback for the core rules exists to that. But I don't know. Maybe we'll be lucky and folks we covered all of the typos but that we missed in the core rules. So hit die is the first mechanical element that we get to on the page. They have a D10 hit die. This is basically useless for us as developers for Savage Worlds because our health system doesn't work at all like theirs. You could theoretically try and extrapolate out, okay, well, what type of vigor does X number of hit dice relate to, right? But for the most part, that's not really going to be super useful for us as it comes to designing these edges, so we can kind of skip over it. So then we come to the requirements, which is a little more useful for us in figuring out our edges. So a base attack bonus of +6. Again, we can kind of try and say, okay, well, on the arc of the 20 levels that you have in Pathfinder and on the arc of the 20 advances from novice to legendary that you have in Savage Worlds, what type of base attack bonus equates to what level of rank, right? So we could say, well, you probably have between a +1 and a +4 when you're novice, and then maybe it's a 5 through 8 for seasoned, and then a 9 through 12 for heroic, and then a 13+ for legendary. Those are not actual guidelines, by the way. Those were just basically arbitrary ranges of 4 that I made up. But again, by the nature of our game, I could have what would functionally be the equivalent of a +1 BAB in Pathfinder in Savage Worlds all the way to legendary, just because I never spent dice or spent advances to increase my fighting die. So that's not super useful. Again, we can kind of notionally say, well, you're not a novice character when you're an arcane archer. What's not novice? Well, everything that's not novice is not novice. What's the first option? Seasoned. And also, landing all of the prestige edges at seasoned. Yeah, Havenheart said that they tend to compare ranks to tiers. That's not a bad. Where's my mouse? Oh, I got really confused. So I could see my mouse on the stream preview, and then where I can pop up people's comments was on the right, and my mouse kept disappearing when I went over to the comments because it's screen capturing my other monitor. So I was on the other monitor. That was okay. That's my brain hurts after that one. But yeah, Havenheart said I tend to compare ranks to tiers. That's not a bad way to do it. I think generally speaking, we fall in the same lines, but it's one of those things. This is one of those areas that when we talk about how it's an art, not a science, there's not a straight direct conversion for all of these things. Seasoned feels right for the prestige edges. It allows you to get there in pretty quickly to really diversify your type of character, right? I can be a rogue, and then when I hit seasoned, and I don't remember the requirements, so I might be slightly inaccurate, but I can jump in and start taking assassin, and now I'm not really a rogue anymore. I'm an assassin. That's how people would refer to me. Seasoned feels about right for that. But there are other things like the Mystic Theurge, right? That you barring GM Fiat, really can't be a Mystic Theurge until at least Veteran, because you need 2 arcane backgrounds. So you take your 1 at character creation at Novice, or at some point during Novice if you decide to take the background edge or the professional edge instead. At some point during Seasoned, I take my 2nd arcane background, and then at some point during Veteran, I take Mystic Theurge. So it's kind of it's a mixed bag. Then we see that you have to have a couple of feats for being an arcane archer: point blank shot, precise shot, weapon focus, longbow, or short bow. Well, so if we look at those, right, what's point blank shot say? You get a +1 bonus to attack and damage rolls with ranged weapons at ranges of up to 30 feet. So if they're close, you get a bonus to hit. That's not necessarily a super useful requirement for us. Sorry, I just saw in the chat, PK Levine asking, couldn't you, for example, be a wizard and just take AB Miracles as an advance to become a Mystic Theurge at Seasoned? So this is one of those things where I honestly, I still don't know the answer to this. I think we've talked about it in both ways. I think, and Mike, correct me if you know and I'm wrong, I think our ABs count towards that limit. So they're not classes, but I think, at least at one point we discussed saying that the AB Magic, AB Miracles counts. You could only take one of those per rank. You know, it has that same restriction as a class, even though it's not a class. That might have changed. Again, I don't. I do not try and keep abreast of everything because it's impossible. Okay, so in PK Levine says in 1-1 they do not say they do. Okay, and Mike says you can take class and an AB in Novice. Okay, so yeah, that is a route. And you know, Mike said earlier that you do miss out on some cool things if you just go with the generic AB versus one of the other arcane backgrounds. That's true. But depending on what you're going for, that might be more appropriate. The only thing that you have to make sure is you have the 2 different. But we'll get to the Mystic Theurge in a minute. So point blank shot, the reason it probably exists in Pathfinder is because they want to make sure that you're competent with the bow, because it's going to really suck if you jump into the point blank shot, or if you jump into the arcane archer and you don't have feats like point blank shot, you're probably not that great of an archer. And you shouldn't be a crappy archer if you're taking arcane archer. And so that's kind of why this sits in there. Let me double check. I think our arcane archer doesn't have a shooting required. No, it does. Yeah, so it's got a shooting of D8. So that's our equivalent, right? So that covers point blank shot from Pathfinder. And you know, precise shot is just going to be you can shoot at characters in melee without the penalty. And then you have weapon focus, which is just the additional bonuses, you know, the +1 on your attack rolls when you are using a longbow or a short bow, because it's an arcane archer, not an arcane arbalist. So you should be good with the bow. So all of that is basically covered in our shooting. You require a shooting D8 in order to be an arcane archer. So we want to make sure arcane archers do not suck at shooting by making sure that they have a shooting roll versus having a bunch of feats. That's just a different variant of how we handle that. Then their next requirement is the ability to cast first level arcane spells. So there's a bunch of different ways. I mean, some ancestries in Pathfinder allow you to cast first level arcane spells. Other times, you know, you dip into an arcane class to grab those, whatever it might be. But basically, you don't get your magic from being an arcane archer. You have magic and are now applying it to your shooting your bow. Well, our version of that is if you have an arcane background or a mystic power. Now, does that technically mean that you could have a non-arcane spellcaster take arcane archer, right? By default rules, a bog standard cleric does not qualify for arcane archer because they have faith-based spells, they have divine spells as opposed to arcane magic. Yes, but it wasn't such a big issue to us that we really felt like we needed to really split hairs. There are so many different ways that you can basically do that. I forget what it is for clerics, but I know there is a way where you can get functionally arcane spells, have your spells count as arcane spells, or just get arcane spells as a cleric in Pathfinder, and then you would qualify for arcane archer, right? And still just being a cleric is just one of the variants. And that's something that we run up to a lot, right? We're just focusing on the core rules, so we're not including the, I don't think it's part of the core rules of the variant of cleric that you take in order to become an arcane cleric. But we basically often think of that as an allowance for not being as stringent, right? It's fine for us to let a cleric be a arcane archer because you could figure out a way to do that in Pathfinder, and our system just being a little bit more open, that's kind of true of the way we do things. I saw from Compost 33, did you consider trademark weapon for weapon focus? Not really. So again, we didn't start with the requirements and say, let us duplicate all of the requirements. Honestly, we started with, what does it do? And then when we were looking at requirements, we were like, okay, well, what makes sense? And then we double check against the requirements. It's just a little easier for us to, instead of going out of nothing into what it is, to map it to the page here so we can kind of follow along. So our process was, let's figure out, we would look at the abilities that an arcane archer has, figure out what cool stuff do you get for having those prestige edges, and then when it comes time to put it on the page and lay it out and put it in the summary and say, what do you need? We said, okay, well, season for prestige edges makes sense. And then arcane archer, you need magic and you need to have a certain shooting. And then we would look over at what is it in Pathfinder and double check that we've not made something that's very weird and off base, because it should still feel like the same thing. And so requiring either a mystic powers or arcane background, both of those give you access to powers. That covers you need spells. D8 shooting is our version of having those feats and the BAB. We'll jump into the thing folks are talking about in chat about class edges towards the end, just because it's not about prestige edges, so I don't want to take a point in the middle to talk about that stuff. So we'll hit on that a little bit later. So then you get to class skills, and we basically just ignore this section. Our game doesn't work like that, right? You don't get the points to increase your skills based on the class that you take. You can do that at any point that you get in advance. So the fact that they have more, what class skills they have, the number of points that they get, plus their int modifier, then that doesn't work for us. So there's not a lot of juice in Savage Worlds to really focus on that. So then we get into the meat of it, which is the class features, and we can kind of see an overview here with the Arcane Archer table. Again, the 1st through 10th is only really useful insofar as helping us decide at what point in our edge tree should the ability pop up. We can basically ignore BAB, fort save, ref save, save. Spells per day, we can basically ignore because unless there was like a massive jump, right? And that was a element of the prestige class, that they get this big influx of spells for taking this prestige class, at which point we might think about, doing something like a mystic background or a mystic training, mystic powers, whatever it is. I forget. There've been a lot of names. And unless that's a big element of it, and we're going to dedicate one of the prestige edges to it, we can basically ignore that because we're not worrying about spell slots. So then we've got imbue arrows, or enhance arrows, imbue arrows, seeker arrow, phase arrow, hail of arrows, and arrow of death. And so let's go ahead and just go bit by bit. Again, we can skip over proficiencies and spells per day. Let's look at what do enhanced arrows get you. At first level, every non-magical arrow an arcane archer knocks and lets fly becomes magical, gaining a +1 enhancement bonus. So this is actually where we took some language from Pathfinder, just because it's kind of it's more on the flavor side. And so they talk about, and so the original draft of Arcane Archer basically used that language of when you knock an arrow is when your arrow is imbued with that magical energy. And the reason they have it is that tells you where in the action economy that happens. And that's actually also useful for us as well, because we've got things like rapid shot, where I'm going to fire 2 arrows at once, basically. Well, if we said, once per action, you can imbue your arrows with your power, then that means, so if I can do it once per action, well, if I'm just shooting once, that's fine. That's not a problem. But if I'm using rapid shot, all of a sudden I need to think about which of my 2 arrows is getting the power put into it. And that didn't necessarily feel like a great constraint to put on it. So the fact that they already have the language of it's when you knock the arrow, well, in order to fire my 2 shots for rapid shot, I have to knock both those arrows before I fire, right? I knock, I draw, I release. So that means that I can do 2 of the same or 2 different of my abilities as an arcane archer using rapid shot. That sounds fun. And so we started there, right? It's one of those instances where we just started with the more powerful sounding version, because if it was a problem, then we'd dial it back. A +1 enhancement bonus is, it's not a lot in Pathfinder, which is why they've got a whole bunch of other things that you add in here. So unlike magic weapons created by normal means, the archer need not spend gold pieces to accomplish this task. However, an archer's magic arrows only function for him. There's a lot of language in there to basically cover all of the caveats and edge cases and all of those things that are rampant throughout Pathfinder, right? So sorry, I'm catching up on chat because I realized I had the PDF over chat. So they've got a lot of ground that they have to cover in every ability. This is kind of that symptom of 3.5 D&D, that it's an incredibly robust rule set, right? Both 3.5 and Pathfinder, but it means that there's a lot of text because you've got to cover a lot of edge cases and caveats in the way that things interact, all in the one ability. PK Levine asked, if I can get it up, why don't the arrow qualities require PowerPoints or a casting roll? So technically speaking, and we'll get to this, but technically speaking, they do use a casting roll. They just use your shooting for casting. And the PowerPoints thing is largely because it didn't make it feel more fun, and there are some instances in which you use PowerPoints. So when we get into the abilities, you kind of see why a little bit. So John Doom asked, he hasn't played Pathfinder in a long time, and he's more familiar with 5th edition D&D. Do archers still suck? I don't think archers ever really sucked. That sentiment is kind of, I don't think they ever really sucked. I think people said they sucked in terms of, I need to have the absolute max damage output possible because I've spent 10 hours just designing all of the different edges and things that I'm going to take in Pathfinder to, make this monster. So I don't think they ever really sucked. I've had plenty of fun playing archers in Pathfinder. I've had plenty of fun playing archers in D&D, and I've certainly had fun playing the arcane archer in our playtests. Yeah, so Grom Molotov kind of, they're consistent DPS, but they're not extremely high DPS. So it's kind of depends on what you mean by suck. Yeah, and Mike brought up a great point about the not having you do spellcasting rolls and then rolling to hit, because now we have to roll twice for one attack, and I'm already having to roll 2 skill dice when I'm doing rapid shot and decide for each of these shots what I'm activating and who I'm targeting. So now I've got another layer of things I have to do. And now that that ability didn't go off, I have to redo the math that I was going to do for that shot. Does not help us out. So looking at the rest of enhanced arrows, right? In addition, the arcane archer's arrows gain a number of additional qualities as he gains additional levels. Elemental burst, and align qualities can be charged once per day while the arcane archer prepares spells, or in the case of spontaneous spellcasters, after 8 hours of rest. One moment as I reread that to parse it again. Oh, right. It's changing what the specific flavor of those do, right? So for third level, every non-magical arrow fired by an arcane archer, and notice they've also got that in every line, they've got that caveat language, right? You can't do this with a magic arrow. That's most likely because of some sort of balancing thing that they want to do, so that way you don't get crazy enchanted arrows and then have them be further crazy enchanted arrows by the enhanced arrow. And also that just kind of fits into their dichotomy of how things do and do not stack in Pathfinder. So they've got that language. We don't, that's not an inherent worry of ours, right? We don't worry about covering all the edge cases when we're building something, because that just complicates things. So they can gain one of the fundamental elemental themed weapon qualities: flaming, frost, or shock. And so if we, just to make sure that we know what's going on, if we look at that, right, we go to flaming, it deals an extra 1d6 points of fire damage on a hit. Well, so that right there, that's a pretty easy thing to replicate in our game, because we don't have, okay, here's this list of 15 different things that you can put on as, frost and shock and air and earth and all that stuff. We've got that condensed down into one thing: trappings, right? And so we don't have to create a new list of, here are the different things that the arcane archer can put on their arrows. We can just say they can imbue their arrows with trappings, right? And they choose the trapping when they fire the arrow, and there you go. Now we've, in a very simple manner, using a rule that already exists, have covered what this lower level arcane archer ability does. And so that's why, if you look at arcane archer, they have 2 qualities that they can put into their arrows: enhance and trapping. And trapping is covering that flaming, frost, shock. It's something that is kind of, when you think about an arcane archer and the types of things that they can do, them making their arrows flaming arrows just out of nowhere, that is, that is something that is very emblematic of the fantasy of an arcane archer. And so including that, right, especially given the fact that it's not a difficult mechanic for us to implement, it'd be silly not to. Yeah. Mike was talking about, in our playtest, I used the trapping to great effect against a frost white and a red dragon. I think we would have had a very, very rough time against that dragon were it not for me dumping in frost arrows into him over and over and over again. Primarily because of the 3 people fighting it, I was the only one with any sort of range. And so Shane and Simon's characters are both jumping off roofs, swinging their blades at its underbelly, trying to hit it because it's just floating there in the air. So then we look at 5th level, every non-magical arrow fired by the arcane archer gains the distance weapon quality. We can take a look at that. And it doubles the range increment of the weapon. Okay, that's not too bad. We have range increments as well, so that's something that we could easily throw in and implement. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind, as that's a very non-difficult thing to put in if we're looking for simple things to drop into the edges. At 7th level, they gain one of the elemental burst, and if we look at the elemental burst, so it's like flaming, but it explodes on a successful critical hit. Deals an extra 1d10 points of damage on a successful critical hit. Its multiplier is 3. Add 2 extra 2d10 fire damage instead, and the multiplier is 4. Like, oh goodness. Okay, sorry. That's the if their multiplier is 3, right? And so there's a lot here. And basically this is taking flaming and making it better, right? There, and that's something that if you're playing Pathfinder, you need, because your uh earlier abilities, generally speaking, unless they upgrade in some way, will become obsolete when you hit the higher levels. That's not a thing that we have to worry about, right? Our game, the math and the utility of our abilities, everything is a lot more flat. It doesn't have, we don't start with I have a +1 to hit. By the end, I've got a +28 to hit. Generally speaking, our math is not so exponential, so our stuff doesn't become obsolete. So we can basically just ignore the burst stuff, because that's basically just an upgrade for the earlier elemental traits. And our trappings are the same amount of useful basically throughout the entire novice to legendary power curve. So then we get to 9th level, and they can be basically tied to an alignment. Well, that's super easy for us. We are not doing alignment, right? We've got the good and evil, right? Because it's a fantasy game. You can't get away from, in most games, you can't get away from good and evil. And so we have those as tags for, things like the Paladin's smite ability and, or not smite, is it smite? I forget which ability name is for the Paladin doing extra damage or whatever it is to evil creatures. We've got that, but we do not have the 3x3 alignment grid. So we can basically just stop reading this here and move on, because that's not something that's going to be useful for us. And then they, again, have more language caveating for how you interface with magic arrows. Robin Savage asks, monks cannot take arcane archer. Right. So, okay. And so Robin Savage says, the monk says mystic power systems grant edges access to edges that require an arcane background. The reason that the monk can still take arcane archer, though, is, and let me open up my PDF so I quote exactly. Arcane archer requirements: seasoned, arcane background any, or mystic powers any. Right. So we have covered that's one of those things that I think probably in V1 we did not say mystic powers, because we just hadn't done that pass of like, let's make sure all the requirements do what we want. But in V11 we added in mystic powers counting for a bunch of stuff because it should. So if you've got mystic powers, you'll be able to take arcane archer. Does that mean that a wider variety of people are going to be able to take arcane archer than in Pathfinder? Theoretically, but that's kind of our game, so we're not super worried about it. Tech Ogre says the ability is smite evil. Oh, don't worry, Robin Savage. It's not just a matter of reading it, but it is a matter of Savage Pathfinder has been our life for like the past 8 months. So we've very much internalized a lot of this stuff. Not everything, but a lot. So then we go down to imbue arrow. You can put a spell on an arrow, and I'm basically going to stop reading there, because at that point we're getting into the very noodly details of Pathfinder. So just to recap, I'm not going to go through all of them, but we kind of, after we've hit these first few, we've got our bullet list, right, that we've created of what are things that we could pull out. Well, gaining just a bonus to hit is a good thing to pull out from enhanced arrow. Then having the ability to basically put in a trapping that's useful, right? So maybe that will be one of our abilities. Increasing the range of our arrow, which would technically speaking be increasing the range of our bow, but still, that sounds like a good thing to potentially use. We're skipping over the burst, we're skipping over the alignment stuff, and now we've got, okay, I can cast my spells through my shots. So we've already got a list of 4 different things that we could do, and we've got 3 edges to deal with. And that's kind of when you hit the point of thinking, okay, well, how many things should an edge do? Well, if we take a look, right, and we're going to kind of work backwards because we're gonna talk about the conclusion and kind of go to how we get there as opposed to going from okay, we've got a couple of options. What do we do now? So if we look at what the Arcane Archer in Savage Pathfinder actually ends with, they quote, an arcane archer uses magical energies to amplify his arrows or bolts. He may also automatically grant one quality into any arrow he fires, designated per shot. The first two qualities an archer learns are enhance. The archer's arrow adds +1 to shooting and damage. Trapping. The arrow has an environmental trapping such as cold, fire, darkness, etc. Right. So one of the things that is kind of generally true about the arcane archer, and that in my experience, and I think other people could back this up, it's one of the cool things is the list of things I can now do with my arrow, right? It used to be that as just if I'm just playing a fighter or whatever and I'm shooting arrows, I don't make a decision on what I do, what arrows I fire for the most part, right? There aren't arrows that have blunt tips and then jagged tips and then poison tip. Like there is to a certain degree, but most people, they're just firing regular arrows most of the time. It's not unless you're really dedicated to trying to make specific arrows and get magic arrows and all that, that you have that Hawkeye notion of, there's the 15 different types of arrows in my quiver that I get to use. The place that you get that is the Arcane Archer. Well, if that's one of the things that makes the Arcane Archer feel cool, then our edges should probably reflect that. So let's make our prestige edges. The thing that you get for being an Arcane Archer is you get to choose from this list of abilities that you have what to do when you fire an arrow. And so that's why we've ended with, I think, 5. Let me double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've ended with 6 different options, 2 per edge. So that also means that that's something that we have to think about when we're balancing what the Arcane Archer can do, right? Something that is super duper useful in Pathfinder should probably be a little less useful because we're not getting Arcane Archer over the course of 10 levels. We're getting it over the course of 3 edges. And we want to make sure that there's always 2 options. That way the player has choice. So let's make sure that the utility is not super crazy. So enhance, the archer's arrow adds +1 to shooting and damage. Generally speaking, when you see an ability in Pathfinder that is some sort of like stacking bonus that they get over time, right? They get a +1, and then level 3 they get a +2, and then level 5 they get a +4. And how it augments over time. Well, again, our math is more flat. So we don't need that number to go up over time. And the fact that we're giving a bonus is more valuable by the nature of how our math works out. So just give them a +1, right? Generally speaking, we like to keep things in the +2 to +4 rate, either a +2 or a +4. But again, if this was the only ability that you got for this edge was every time you shoot an arrow, you get a +2 to hit and damage, then it probably would still be a +2. But because we're giving you another ability in addition on this prestige edge, let's tweak the numbers a little bit, make that enhance a little less powerful, and then give you something else. And so then we give you the trappings, right? And there's another element of this that is important, especially when you're thinking about, okay, we're going to design something in a list, which is we're giving you the 2 options. We want to make sure that there's kind of the default, that there's situationality to it, and there's also kind of a utility to it. So at the first level, right, we want you to be able to use your Arcane Archer stuff all the time because you're an Arcane Archer. That's the thing that's cool about you is you didn't take an Arcane background and go and become a wizard that can cast more spells. You took Arcane Archer because you wanted to do cool things with your arrows. So let's give you a daily driver. It's going to be that +1 enhancement bonus, right? If you're not thinking at all, you're just going to take the +1 enhancement bonus because it's +1 to hit and damage, universally useful. But when the situation calls for it and you can think a little more tactically, I can now spend some time thinking, okay, what trapping might be really effective against this character? For example, there was one playtest we did where there was a character standing in water. And I was like, oh, awesome. I'm going to put a lightning trapping on my arrow. So that way, when they get hit, the lightning goes through the water and it's going to electrocute them some more. I'm going to get some synergy. There we go, right? I was able to make a tactical in the moment decision. But if I just if I wasn't paying attention, or if I just didn't know what to do, or I wasn't thinking right, I didn't understand the situation, I can just default back to my daily driver, +1 to hit, +1 to damage, good to go. And so you see that kind of generally speaking throughout the options that we provide when you get a list of options. We've already given you kind of 2 daily drivers, right? You've got your enhance arrow, which is always useful, and trapping, which does not have a limit to its usage, so you can use it all the time if you want. And then we go into arcane archer 2. Well, we've already given you options you can use all the time, so now let's give you something that's a little more powerful, but more restricted. So we jump into phase arrow, right? You can shoot through non-magical barriers, ignoring penalties for cover or concealment, right? That is somewhat our version of seeker arrow, where it negates cover and concealment modifiers, but otherwise you roll normally. And then hail of arrows, where that is our literally their hail of arrows, and also our phase arrow and our seeker arrow kind of mixed and matched. But we also have hail of arrows, which is just you attack in a template, right? But because both of those abilities are going to be especially lethal in the situations that you're going to use them, right? There's a group of goblins, hail of arrows, everybody's taking damage. It's the equivalent of me taking 8 actions and shooting each goblin once. Well, we don't want you to be able to do that all the time, so let's make it once per encounter, right? And that's the lever we have to pull for. We need this to be more powerful because we want it to feel really cool and epic, but because it feels really cool and epic, let's restrict its usage. And then we get into imbue and death arrow, which again, imbue is pretty powerful because you're able to cast your area of effect spells into your shot. And then, like Mike mentioned earlier, we don't want you to have to make 2 or 3 rolls for everything you're trying to do. So for simplicity, we roll your spellcasting roll into your shooting roll, so it does 2 things at once. But I'm able to cast only this narrow selection of powers, so that helps make it not as super powerful, so it's a little more balanced. And now I have to spend my power points, right? I'm still casting the power, I'm still activating it, so I have to spend power points. So now there's another resource that I have to manage while using this edge. So this element of this edge that on the surface seems like it is way better, right? And maybe even worth more than an edge. Because we use the other levers that we have, we've brought its power down to where it is half of this edge. And then you pair that with Death Arrow, and Death Arrow seems super powerful, right? Once per day, you can fire this arrow, and if you shake or wound them, then they have to make a vigor roll or die. Well, again, we've already pulled some levers to make it not so powerful, so that way it does add up to half of this prestige edge once per day, right? And that also matches with what you see in Pathfinder with the Arrow of Death, right? They create an Arrow of Slaying, and it's basically once per day they can make it. We didn't want to add in, now I've got this inventory of arrows that I have to track, so we just, it's just, you can use this ability once per day as opposed to crafting an arrow. And then it only happens when the target is shaken or wounded, right? So if I don't roll a bunch of damage, because I'm still limited by just what damage do I roll with my shot, and I don't shake them, then my death arrow doesn't have an effect, right? If they manage to soak all the wounds I dealt, then John Doom, you just asked that, so I think the per day or per rest, it is once per day. Again, we don't have that dichotomy of you're going from rest to rest, right? You're not. It's long rests aren't a thing in our game, so once per day is the language that we use for this kind of stuff. But so now my target has to be shaken or wounded, which means it's not just happening, period, and they have to make a vigor roll. So yes, I could shoot my death arrow at the big baddie of the adventure, get lucky and shake them, and then get also lucky and they fail their vigor roll and die. But imagine all the things that have to go exactly right. So I have to hit, which is not guaranteed, but I've got bennies. I can probably make sure I hit. And I only, generally speaking, need a 4 target number. But cover, concealment, all those things. And I can't use my death arrow with my phase arrow. So I basically have to shoot a regular arrow. And then I have to shake or wound them. If either of those things don't happen, either because they spent bennies to soak or to eliminate the shaken effect, which is something that we've clarified because of other abilities that popped up. If you're shaken and you immediately spend that Benny to unshake, it's you're canceling the shaken. So you were never shaken to begin with. So if I only shook them, but they have a Benny to spend, they can avoid having to make the vigor roll entirely. And then you finally get to the part where you are going to instantly kill them, and now they make a vigor roll. And generally speaking, if it's the big bad, they probably have a decent vigor. Maybe they've boosted it. Maybe they just have a naturally high vigor. Maybe they have a bonus to vigor rolls. Maybe they've got a whole bunch of bennies that they can use in order to make sure that they get the 4 that they need in order to succeed and not die. So there's a lot of things that have to happen between me deciding to use this arrow and it hitting for it to actually kill somebody. And because we have all those levers, we would pull that back up. Havenheart, would heavy armor negate it entirely? I don't remember the specific wording of heavy armor off the top of my head because I don't think I've ever used it for anything in a game I've run. Theoretically, if it says that you can't be damaged by not heavy weapons, then probably. Um, but again, I and Mike would know more than me. I can't think of anything that has heavy armor at the moment. I think maybe like the Terrask would. But I don't think dragons have heavy armor. I don't know that there's much of anything that has heavy armor in Savage Pathfinder. But so we've kind of gone through and talked about, okay, this was how we started, right? Let's think about what does this class do? What are the things that we can easily pull because they are in alignment with our rules? Then we can think about what are the things that are not necessarily in alignment with our rules, but are so emblematic of the class that we have to have it, right? Arrow of Death is super like that is a cool ability that Arrow of Death is a cool ability that arcane archers have. That's what people think about. One of the things people think about when they talk about arcane archers, we should allow our players to do that because that's part of the fantasy of being an arcane archer. And then we just have to go through and think about what are the conditions in which these abilities can be used, how regularly can they be used, how much resources do they have, but we have those levers in order to make these things feel appropriately balanced. Mike said that very old dragons have heavy armor, and if you have a weapon with brutal on it, you can bypass heavy armor. Yeah, so that's the other thing, right? Just by the nature of our game, we don't have that delineation of it's only non-magical arrows and so far, right? If you've got a magic bow, you're getting the effect from that, right? So in this example, you can have a bow with brutal on it, and now everything counts as heavy armor, or as a heavy. Your arrows count, your shots count as heavy weapons, and so you bypass that. So now let's jump back to some questions that we had. Actually, I'm going to just grab tech overviews real quick because it is about prestige edges. Lore Master 2, the example of taking the rogue sneak attack gives you all the advantages of taking the rogue class edge without the armor restriction. Also, what's stopping you from taking an extra arcane background without the armor restriction? I like the idea, but it could be abused. Well, I don't think it says that. Let's go ahead and take a look at it real quick. Oh, and let me change. We don't need the Pathfinder stuff up. So let's see. Lore Master. With the game master's consent, she may take one ability from any core class edge she doesn't already have. She may take the Drew's Wilderness Strike ability, for example, Rogue Sneak Attack. Okay, no, sorry, it's different than I think when I last read it. One ability. That's probably something that might be some language that we need to clean up on that. I was the guinea pig for the Mystic Theurge, not the designer. So I can't tell you what the intention is there. Yeah, that's a good point. Because, for instance, the armor interference is a separate bullet from the arcane background. We are saying you take one ability from the from the class edge. So you would either take the arcane background sorcerer or the armor interference cloth or the bloodline, theoretically. So I think the intention behind that is that armor interference and the arcane background would be linked. right? Because if we go up to the generic arcane backgrounds, magic and miracles, arcane background magic has an armor interference with it. Arcane background miracles has sins with it. So I think those are technically elements of the background and not elements of the class edge. Now, in the example of the rogue with the armor restriction, again, I think that's just a either the presentation or the wording needs to be cleaned up because the rogue does not have multiple elements of the class edge. It just has armor restriction and it just has sneak attack for the default rogue. So I guess at some point, I don't think it's in here, but we will be adding. You get thieves can't as an automatic from it. I remember us talking about that. So that's one of those things I think that probably just needs to be that language needs to be cleaned up a little bit. Let's roll back up real quick. Uh, Christian Serrano said, so class edges are now designed to be better than background edges, or rather than equivalent to as previously presented. Nope. That's why they've got, yeah, like PK Levine, they've got drawbacks that make them roughly balance out. Again, if folks disagree with our evaluation of what makes them balance out, that's reasonable. But that is the thing that we're going towards. I I think something that folks should keep in mind is there's a difference between them not being balanced to the same and not being as sexy, right? So if I can do a whole bunch of cool things, but I've got a couple of drawbacks, it seems like, oh man, this is just so way better that why would I ever take these other edges? Well, because they don't have the drawbacks, because they don't have those things that could get you into a lot of trouble. But we definitely did go into the class edges with in mind of we want these to be really cool. We want people to really be like, oh, that's an awesome edge. I want that. And that's kind of the fun of it, right? Like if we added in class edges and they were all kind of lame and not really that distinct from other edges, they're more complex than your average edge, absolutely. But they've got both pros and cons. And the whole point is because you're playing Pathfinder. The classes are cool in Pathfinder, right? That's part of the game. So let's make them cool. Well, Christian Serrano, I don't think that you should uh, be free of FOMO for taking a background edge and not a class edge. You're playing Savage Pathfinder. Like, again, if they were kind of, if the class edges were like, okay, that's cool, I guess. Then what was the point of designing them in the first place? Like the edges, like your default background edges are flavorful, right? They are. I come from, you should choose a background edge because you thought, okay, where does my character come from? And you're like, I want to see that reflected in the mechanics of my character. But this is Pathfinder, so the classes are some of the are a big amount of the juice, right? So we want folks to take classes. They're something we talked about originally. It wasn't you get just a free class edge or a professional edge or a background edge. It was just you get a free class edge because it's Pathfinder, right? Of course, we want folks that want to have a more kind of Savage Worldsy feeling character to be able to do that, which is why we changed the exact text. But at the end of the day, you know, you can play. I think we said this very early on one of the other design corners or in a stream. You can play any other Savage Worlds game and not have classes. You can not have class edges. This is the one you play for class edges. If you don't like class edges that much that it kind of ruins the game for you, then maybe don't play with them. But that's kind of that's where people should be seeing having some of the fun. Um, and again, we're never going to be able to make it so that everybody feels like everything is equally valuable choice. That would mean that they're bad choices. There should be points where you're like, oh man, that's just so cool, I can't resist. because that edge or that class, that prestige edge is to your taste. You're just like, oh man, that sounds something like super, super fun. Not many casters walk around with heavy armor, and going from cloth to from light to cloth, for example, isn't a huge drawback. Well, you haven't been one shot in one of our playtests because you've got very low toughness, but I have. So it's again it's one of those things where it's completely valid to be like I don't think these balance out, but again, try it out. If you don't like it, you can always modify it, use them differently, however you want. But at the end of the day, this stuff is always going to be subjective, right? And we're presenting what we think is generally speaking fairly balanced and fairly useful. If your mileage varies, then it again. I'm always a big proponent of if you don't like it, change it. But we feel like we're doing a pretty good job at making these class edges pretty good. Now again, there are some folks that there's some like Christian also brought up there's some disparity between clerics and druids, and some have armor interference and some don't. I think I saw PK Levine mentioned that yeah, that oh, stop sending messages, people. I'm trying to read the chat. That miracles right now is just worse off than the cleric because the cleric gets channel energy and the miracles still has the full thing of sins, and that either the cleric needs another drawback to balance it out, or miracles needs to lose or reduce sins. Yeah, that's just again, I agree with you. I think that's appropriate. That's why we made the change to AB Magic of how they can wear up to medium armor, no problem. Um, Part of it is because that stuff exists not as a partially as a balancing mechanism, but also as a setting mechanism, right? In Galarian, arcane magic is it's inhibited by wearing armor. In Galarian, your divine abilities are tied to a god, and they have sins that can cause you problems, right? So those are in there partially because that's what AB Miracles looks like in Galarian. But I agree that there needs to be some movement there. Maybe something like maybe changing the penalties that you get. Maybe just saying there are no mortal sins and only minor and major sins, so that you can never because you're not a cleric and thus not a super exemplifier of your religion, you can never really disappoint your deity. Maybe. Um, so Havenheart said that channel energy is basically a cleric staple, so it should be an extra layer on top of generic AB miracles. Actually, I thought I knew. I thought I parsed that. Basic cleric staple, so it should be an extra layer on. I think now I get what you're saying is that clerics should have something extra on top of miracles because it's for clerics. But yeah, that's something that we just have to kind of massage. PK Levy was asking about Assassin 3 means you have a good chance to one shot any boss once they're out of bennies. Is that OP? Let me read what it says because I got no idea what it says. Uh, bu- bu- bu. Assassin 3. Angel of Death. The Slayer gains the mystic ability to charge her attack with lethal death energy. Sorry, I think it was. When we were rewriting uh, the Arrow of Death. The first draft of the rewrite of Arrow of Death was it said death energy, like death and death energy, like three times in the same sentence, and we spent a good 5 minutes making fun of that before we rewrote it. So sorry, that just hit me. Slayer gains the mystic ability to charge her attack with lethal death energy. If she just does so, a victim slain by her. Okay, so that's probably not what you're talking about. Swift death once per day. An assassin gains a drop over foe of her choice, even if the target is completely aware of her presence. And so you're saying uh, you get the drop, use it with sneak attack at your bonus damage, probably raise, and then save or die. So because you're getting the plus, so it is a lot of damage. So, uh, yes and no. So one, right in the example that you brought up. So I don't think the first ability was a one shot against a healthy boss. It's just both, and I wasn't sure which part because again, I don't have all the edges in my head. But the second one, I can see what PK Levine means, but I think the thing that you've said in your original question is part of the caveat. Once they're out of bennies, right? So if you if you've gotten the bad guy to a point where they're out of bennies, you've already done some work. Not too worried about it, right? If they have a single Benny, then they're if they're the big bad of the adventure, they probably have a decent vigor, and they're probably going to soak something. And again, it doesn't matter how many raises you get on your damage for wound cap, right? So if they are unwounded and they soak one wound and they take 3 wounds, then they're still up. If they have some damage, that means they have to soak more wounds. But at the end of the day, that's true for basically anything, right? Does this give you more opportunity to do a whole bunch of burst damage? Yeah, well, if they take even 1 wound, then it's save or die after soaking. But again, you've dealt a wound to them, you've sapped them of all their bennies, right? You've done other work in the combat. Am I maybe in Swift Death? Because you're saying if they take even 1 wound, it's save or die. No, if they only take 1 wound from your ability, it's not save or die. If they have 1 wound and then you deal 4 wounds, then they have to soak at least 2 wounds in order to not die. But you have to drop them for swift death to evaporate them. Death attack. Are we reading two different things? Oh, you said Assassin 3, so I didn't read Assassins 1 or 2. Assassin 1, if the assassin strikes living trial with a dart and causes 1 wound, vigor roll or die. Hmm. So, yeah, we probably need to look at that. I don't know if that's the intention. So I strike a living victim with the drop, which I automatically get because I have swift death. Eh, yeah, I get what you mean, but again, I can force the drop on one target once per day. That does suck if it is your big bad. Hmm. Yeah, we'll have to take a look at that one because again, I did not I was not involved in Assassin, so I can't say as to what the intent is. It might be that is kind of the intent. Um, in which case there probably should be a couple more hoops that you have to jump through. And it might just be that maybe just automatically giving you the drop is a little too much. Not sure. But that's something that we will have to probably take a look at. Um, and yeah, Tech Ogre AB Magic does have the medium armor interference. So you can wear, I think it's medium armor. It has armor interference, but we've bumped it up so that way it's not as bad as the any armor interference that you get from like wizard and sorcerer, but it is still again, it's still an element uh of the setting. So yeah, we'll take a look at the assassin again, just because you're right, that does seem pretty nasty, but it might just be that the intention is it should be really freaking nasty, because I've spent 3 edges to be able to do this one thing once per day. Again, it is pretty nasty against the big bad. It's currently light. I thought maybe I'm thinking of with the edge to bump up your armor, you can get up to medium armor, and that was the balance. Again, if I were able to keep all the, I'm not Clint. Clint can keep all the rules in his head much better than I can. Yeah, so if they use medium or heavy armor shields, yeah. So that's probably what it was. Is you then take the arcane armor edge or whatever we called it to bump that up one, and now you can wear medium armor. You're still not wearing heavy armor, which sounds about right for your kind of generic arcane caster on Galarian, and that leaves us open to do other things, like with the Magus and whatnot later. That's the other thing that folks should keep in mind, right? We're doing the core rules. So if you want to play a Magus and you're like, oh, why don't the core rules allow me to play a Magus? That's because the core Pathfinder rules don't let you play a Magus either. Um, so we're not trying to cover everything that you could do in first edition Pathfinder in one book. So keep that in mind. But so we kind of covered a lot of ground, a lot of specific implementation stuff that again is always subject to change. The book's not done until we send it to the printers, and even then, is it really done? It's just we can no longer make changes to it. But we talked about kind of give you a high level look at like what does it look like when you're going from a class edge or a prestige class to a class edge, kind of a high level view of what that process looks like. And again, specific implementation is always going to be different, right? That's kind of if you took the general process that we had either working on specific class edges or talking about them. So all of those things, it's any designer is going to do it a little differently and in different steps and different orders, but that's kind of a good generic set for you folks to work with. So with that said, we will be back next week, same time, Thursday, 2 p.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic for next week, I'm going to have a special guest come on, Sean Roberson, the line developer for Savage Rifts. He's going to come on and we are going to talk about going from one outside setting to another in a macro sense, right? He's working with let's bring Rifts into Savage Worlds. We're working and bring Pathfinder into Savage Worlds. What that process looks like, and then in the back half, we will specifically talk about what that looked like for the power system in Savage Rifts as well. So you can go back and watch last week's episode and hear myself and Mike Barbeau from the Savage Pathfinder team talk about building and the changes and the design that went behind the changes to spellcasting in Savage Pathfinder. And next week, we'll be talking to Sean to kind of get an insight into what that looked like for Rifts and also kind of a little bit more of a discussion on a macro lens of we're working with another game system and another game setting and we're bringing it into Savage Worlds. What does that process look like? Until then, see you folks later.